In the autumn of 170, on the muddy banks of the Danube, the most powerful man on earth was sitting in a campaign tent, writing notes to himself in Greek. Outside, his army was dying of plague. Inside the tent, by lamplight, the emperor wrote one short sentence over and over in different forms. "You have power over your mind, not over what happens. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't writing a book. He never intended for you to read it. The notebook you now know as Meditations was a private training log, and Marcus Aurelius was rehearsing a set of mental moves the way a surgeon rehearses an incision. He believed that if he ran the routines often enough, his nervous system would change. He was right. He just didn't have the imaging equipment to prove it. Today, you have the equipment: fMRI scanners, vagal tone monitors, cortisol assays, and every time scientists turn one of those instruments on a person practicing what Marcus practiced, they find the same thing. The Stoics weren't telling you to repress your feelings. They were prescribing the exact circuit-level intervention that modern neuroscience has spent 30 years confirming. This isn't a story about ancient philosophy. It's a story about what happens, biologically, in the half-second between someone insulting you and your decision not to react. You're about to learn what Marcus Aurelius was really doing on horseback at the edge of the empire. You're about to learn the brain surgery he was performing on himself without a scalpel every single morning for almost 20 years. Before you can understand what Stoicism does to a brain, you have to know which parts of the brain it's working on. There are four. The first is the amygdala, two almond-shaped clusters buried deep behind your eyes. Their job is to flag anything that might hurt you and slam the gas pedal on your stress response before your conscious mind has even registered what happened. The amygdala fires in roughly 12 milliseconds. Your awareness of it lags by about 300. By the time you know you're angry, the chemistry is already moving. The second is the prefrontal cortex, the thin sheet of gray matter behind your forehead, in particular the right ventrolateral PFC and the ventromedial PFC. This is the part of your brain that can talk the amygdala down. It does so through a network of inhibitory connections that release a neurotransmitter called GABA into the basolateral amygdala. Picture a hand pressing slowly on a brake pedal. The third is the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in your body, wandering from your brainstem down through your throat, your heart, your gut. Its myelinated branch supplies the parasympathetic brake. The stronger that brake, the faster you recover from a spike of arousal. Doctors measure its strength through heart rate variability. People with high HRV stay calm under fire. People with low HRV come apart. The fourth is the default mode network, anchored in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. This is the circuit that runs when nothing else is running. It generates self-referential thought, replays of awkward moments, rehearsals of what you wish you'd said, speculation about what other people think of you. When the default mode network is loud, you can't stop hearing the verdict of an audience that may not even exist. These four structures are the entire stage. Every Stoic exercise you're about to meet was designed to act on one of them. The Stoics didn't know the names. They knew the effects. They mapped the territory blind by feel 2,000 years before anyone could see it on a screen. The first practice is called proseschi. It translates roughly as continuous attention. Marcus and Epictetus both described it the same way. You watch your own mind. When a judgment forms, you notice it forming, and before you act on the impression, you label it. Marcus wrote in Book 5 of Meditations that when something disturbs you, you shouldn't say "I'm unhappy." You should say "an impression has appeared in me, and I haven't yet given my assent." Notice what he's asking you to do. He's asking you to put the feeling into words, specifically into a third-person observation. Not "I'm angry." An impression of anger has appeared. The grammar is doing something. In 2007, a UCLA psychologist named Matthew Lieberman put 30 volunteers in an fMRI scanner and showed them photographs of human faces in states of fear, anger, disgust. Some volunteers were told to match the face to another face. Others were told to do something the Stoics would have recognized instantly. They were told to label the emotion, just one word: angry, afraid. What Lieberman found has been replicated dozens of times since. The labeling condition produced two simultaneous changes. The amygdala on both sides of the brain went quiet. The right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex lit up, and the more the prefrontal cortex worked, the more the amygdala calmed. Naming the emotion was, on the scanner, a kind of inhibition. The act of putting the feeling into language had recruited a break Lieberman called the phenomenon effect labeling. Marcus called it proseschi. The mechanism is identical. Words give your prefrontal cortex something to push against. An unnamed feeling is a fire with no shape. A named feeling is a fire with edges, and edges can be contained. This is the first piece of the brain surgery. When you sit with your morning coffee and you watch the irritation rise in you about an email you haven't yet opened, and you say in your head, "This is the impression of irritation, not me," you aren't being precious. You're physically reducing limbic activity. You're giving the GABA interneurons in your basolateral amygdala the cue to fire. And the more days in a row you do it, the easier the cue becomes to issue. This is the physiology of emotional control. It begins with a name. Now, the second practice, the dichotomy of control. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with it. Some things are up to us, some things aren't. Up to us are our judgments, our intentions, our assent. Not up to us is everything else. Bodies, reputations, other people, the weather. The instruction sounds like a coping aphorism. It's in fact a precise neurological prescription, and here's where most people who think they're practicing Stoicism are doing the exact opposite of what Marcus and Epictetus prescribed. A Stanford psychologist named James Gross has spent 30 years comparing two strategies for handling a difficult emotion. The first is called cognitive reappraisal. You change the way you interpret what happened. Your boss snapped at you. Reappraisal says he's on his fourth day of bad sleep and a sick child. The event hasn't changed. Your assent to one particular meaning of it has changed. The second strategy is called expressive suppression. You feel the same way, you just shove it down and try not to show it. In scanner studies, reappraisal does what you'd hope. The prefrontal cortex comes online, the amygdala calms, the body doesn't pay a price, heart rate stays steady, memory of the event stays clear, suppression looks healthy from the outside, the person keeps a flat face, inside the picture is grim. The amygdala stays lit, the sympathetic nervous system continues to dump adrenaline, blood pressure rises, the person remembers the event less well because the brain is too busy keeping the lid on to encode anything around it. Hold this pattern for years, and the cardiovascular damage is measurable. The Stoic dichotomy of control is a reappraisal protocol. Epictetus isn't telling you to swallow your anger and pretend nothing happened. He's telling you to ask before the reaction sets in whether the thing in front of you was ever yours to control. If it wasn't, the appraisal that says this is a violation of my territory was a category error. The feeling deflates the moment, the appraisal is corrected. The cosplay version of Stoicism that is spread across the internet, the photograph of the marble bust with a quote underneath about being unbothered, is almost always teaching suppression. Bottle it, show nothing, be a wall. The brain of a wall is a brain on fire. The real practice asks something subtler. It asks you to look at the feeling rising and to ask one question: was the trigger ever in my domain? If the answer is no, the appraisal collapses on its own. The amygdala doesn't need to be wrestled, it needs to be talked out of a misunderstanding. That's what the dichotomy of control was. It's the difference between holding a door shut against a storm and noticing that the storm was outside a building you don't live in. In 2003, 3 researchers at UCLA put 13 volunteers in an fMRI scanner and had them play a simple computer game called Cyberball. You toss a virtual ball back and forth with 2 other players. The other players the volunteers told are real people in other rooms. They aren't. They're scripts. After a few minutes of normal play, the script changes. The other 2 players stop throwing the volunteer the ball. The volunteer sits there in the scanner watching a digital ball bounce between 2 strangers who have decided he doesn't exist. The brain scans showed something nobody expected. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex lit up. The anterior insula lit up. These are the same regions that activate when you stub your toe or burn your hand. The brain of an excluded person was processing the exclusion as physical pain. Naomi Eisenberger, the lead author, also noticed something else. In the volunteers whose right ventral prefrontal cortex was active during the rejection, the felt distress was lower. The same break that quieted the amygdala in Lieberman's study was also quieting the social pain circuit. The capacity to not be wrecked by being ignored wasn't a personality trait. It was a neural skill, and it varied across people. This is the neuroscience underneath one of the oldest questions in human life. How to stop caring what others think? The answer isn't that you can switch the caring off at the source. You can't. Your amygdala and your DAC will fire whether you give them permission or not. The wiring is older than civilization. 200,000 years ago, exclusion from the tribe was a death sentence, and the brain still treats a cold look from a colleague as a threat to your survival. What you can change is what happens after the fire starts. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Book 8 of Meditations that it isn't the things themselves that disturb men, but their judgments about these things. He wrote that line directly under the cyberball circuit. He couldn't have known the wording. He had observed the result. The Stoic answer to caring what others think isn't to pretend you don't care, it's to train the prefrontal brake so that the caring doesn't become commanding. You let the DAC fire. You notice it fire, you apply the appraisal. The opinion of a stranger is not in the column of things up to me. The fire dies for lack of fuel. The wound that felt like a stab wound resolves into what it actually was, a signal from a piece of brain hardware that hasn't updated since the savannah. This is what the people who keep their composure under public attack are actually doing. They aren't made of stone. They have a louder break. Seneca, the wealthiest man in Rome and the tutor of the Emperor Nero, made a habit that scandalized his contemporaries. Every evening before bed, he would sit and imagine in vivid detail the things he most feared: exile, loss of his fortune, public humiliation, the death of those he loved. He would sit with each scenario until it stopped feeling foreign. Then he would go to sleep. He called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. To a modern reader, this looks morbid. To a clinical psychologist, it looks like a therapy invented in the 1960s. The technique is called imaginal exposure. You take a feared scenario and you walk through it deliberately, repeatedly, in detail, until the brain stops releasing a stress response when the image appears. The mechanism is called extinction learning. The amygdala learns that the cue is no longer reliably paired with danger. The prefrontal cortex builds a parallel memory that says when this image arises, nothing actually happens. Over time, the second memory dominates. What Seneca was doing on his couch in Rome was running an extinction protocol on himself. Every evening he was practicing the loss of the things he was afraid to lose. He was teaching his amygdala that the image of exile, when it arose unbidden during the day, wasn't the herald of disaster. It was a familiar visitor. The brain that has rehearsed a loss in safety responds to the real loss with a smaller spike and a faster recovery. You can see why this practice produced the Stoic temperament. A man who has already lived through the worst thing that could happen to him in his imagination on a quiet night 400 times is a man who is hard to surprise. When the fall comes, his cortisol curve is shorter. His prefrontal cortex has already mapped the territory. He has been there before. This is the second piece of the surgery. You don't wait for the catastrophe to arrive and then try to handle it. You walk into the catastrophe in the privacy of your own skull every night until your brain stops treating it as new information. By the time it shows up in real life, the wiring is already in place. The third practice is the strangest. The Stoics called it the view from above. Marcus Aurelius returns to it more than 30 times in Meditations. You're to imagine yourself rising first above your body, then above the room, above the city, above the Roman Empire, above the earth. You look down at the human beings moving like ants over the surface of a small planet. You look down at yourself among them. From this height, the offense someone gave you this morning is invisible. From this height, your own ambitions look small and brief. Marcus practiced this exercise in the saddle, on campaign, while reviewing his army. He practiced it on cold mornings before councils. He practiced it as he was dying. For most of the 20th century, the view from above looked, to neuroscientists, like a literary flourish. It's now understood as a precise intervention on the default mode network. The default mode network, as you saw earlier, is the circuit that runs your inner narrator. The narrator's favorite topic is you. What you said, what you didn't say, how you came across, what people thought. The narrator is also the source of most of your suffering, because the version of you the narrator constructs is the small, anxious, threatened protagonist of everything version. When the default mode network is loud, the world shrinks to the size of your own face. Judson Brewer at Yale ran a study in 2011 on long-term meditators. He compared their brains in the scanner to those of novices. The experienced practitioners showed reduced activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, the two anchor nodes of the default mode network. They also showed weaker functional coupling between those nodes. The narrator was running quieter. The protagonist was less central. The view from above does the same thing through imagery, by placing the self at the cosmic scale. The practice forcibly downregulates the medial prefrontal cortex. You can't maintain a vivid image of yourself as a speck on a turning planet and simultaneously sustain the inner monologue about whether your colleague respected you in the meeting. The two scripts can't run together. One displaces the other. Marcus didn't know about the default mode network. He knew that after a few minutes of looking down from imaginary altitude, the things that had been gripping him a moment before had loosened their grip. He used the technique because it worked. The mechanism is now visible. When you take the view from above, you aren't escaping. You're silencing the loudest source of your own suffering by giving it nothing to talk about. Seneca, in On Anger, gives one piece of practical advice that he repeats in different forms. Throughout the book, the greatest remedy for anger is delay. Wait, don't respond now. Give the first heat time to pass. This is the line that the modern self-help industry has flattened into the advice to count to 10. The advice is correct. It's also far more interesting than it sounds, because Seneca was prescribing a specific physiological recovery window. When the amygdala fires, the sympathetic nervous system floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. Heart rate climbs. Vasoconstriction sets in, breathing shallows. This whole cascade can crest in under a second. The recovery is slower. The vagus nerve has to come online and apply the parasympathetic brake. In a person with high heart rate variability, the brake engages cleanly and the system returns toward baseline within 20 to 90 seconds. In a person with low HRV, the recovery takes minutes, sometimes longer. Every word spoken or sent in the first 90 seconds is spoken by the part of the nervous system that thinks the speaker is in physical danger. The prefrontal cortex is offline. The amygdala has the microphone. Seneca knew none of this in those terms. He had simply observed across decades of imperial politics that the men who let their first heat pass before they answered tended to keep their heads, literally. He was watching colleagues lose their lives to single-sentence outbursts at the wrong dinner. He concluded that delay, more than any other quality, distinguished a survivable man from a doomed one. The reason the advice works is that the delay is the exact length of time the vagal brake needs to do its job. After 90 seconds, the prefrontal cortex is back online. Your decision about how to respond is now being made by the part of the brain capable of strategy, not the part capable only of survival. The Stoic who pauses before answering an insult isn't performing restraint. He's waiting for his nervous system to return to him. There's one more system that Stoic practice acts on, and it's the one most relevant to the world you live in now, the reward system. A British neuroscientist named Molly Crockett, building on a line of research at Yale, has shown that the expression of moral outrage online operates on the same reinforcement schedule as a slot machine. You post the angry comment. Sometimes nothing happens, sometimes a flood of likes and shares arrives. The unpredictability of the reward is what hooks the brain. Variable ratio reinforcement is the most powerful learning schedule known to behavioral science. It's what keeps a pigeon pecking a key for hours and a person scrolling for years. The dopamine signal that drives this loop doesn't require that the outrage be justified. It requires only that the expression of outrage occasionally produce social reward. Once that pairing is in place, the brain will look for triggers, it will find them, it will manufacture them. What the Stoic was doing every time he refused to react to a provocation was starving this loop in himself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Book 6 that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. The line reads as moral wisdom. It's also, mechanically, an instruction to break the variable ratio schedule. The provocation is the cue, the reaction is the lever press, the dopamine hit is the reward. Withdraw the lever press and the cue stops triggering. The brain stops being hostage to the people who push its buttons. There's a second consequence, which the Stoics noticed without understanding it. When you don't react, the person who provoked you also doesn't get their reward. Provocation is itself a behavior maintained by reinforcement. The provoker's brain is looking for the reaction. The reaction is the dopamine hit. Withhold the reaction, and the provoker's loop is starved as well. Over time, the provocations stop because the brain that issued them has learned that this particular target produces nothing. This is what Epictetus meant when he said that no one can harm you without your permission. He wasn't making a moral claim. He was pointing out that the harm requires your participation. The reactive system in your brain is the participation. Refuse to participate, and the entire transaction fails. This is the deepest layer of Stoic emotional control. The point was never to look unbothered. The point was to refuse to feed the loops, in yourself and in others, that keep human beings small. There's a footnote to all of this that most people miss. The most empirically validated psychotherapy in the modern world, the one that insurance companies prefer and clinical trials have replicated more than any other, is cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT works by helping a patient notice an automatic thought, identify the appraisal underneath it, and substitute a more accurate one. Albert Ellis, the New York psychologist who built the prototype for CBT in the 1950s, was open about his sources. He named them in print, repeatedly. The framework he wrote was lifted directly from Epictetus. He carried a copy of the Enchiridion in his coat pocket for 50 years. The famous opening of the model, the line about people being disturbed not by things but by their views of them, isn't Ellis. It's Epictetus, written in the 1st century, almost word for word. This means that when you sit in a therapist's office in the year you're sitting in now, and the therapist walks you through the cognitive distortion underneath your panic, the therapist is reading from a script written by a freed Greek slave 1800 years before the existence of the diagnostic manual. The Stoics weren't anticipating modern psychology. Modern psychology was rediscovering Stoicism. The brain hasn't changed. The intervention that worked for Marcus on the Danube works for you on a Tuesday, because the wiring in your skull is the same wiring he was working on in his in 180, on another bank of another river. Marcus Aurelius died of plague. He was 58. He had governed an empire under attack on every frontier for nearly 2 decades, lost most of his children in infancy, watched his closest advisor turn traitor and die. By every account that survives, he conducted himself with the same equanimity in the worst weeks as in the easiest. He wasn't born like that. The notebook makes that clear. The same lessons appear over and over. He kept needing them. The man you read in Meditations isn't a serene philosopher dispensing wisdom. He's a man training a difficult brain in the only way it can be trained, which is by repetition of small acts. That's what the surgery looks like from the inside. You sit with your coffee and you notice the impression of irritation arising, and you label it. You catch the moment your appraisal of an event slips into the column of things up to you when it never was, and you correct it. You see the cold look from a colleague register as a wound, and you wait for the DAC to quiet before you respond. You imagine the thing you fear most in vivid detail until it stops being foreign. You take the view from above briefly at lunch, and your own face becomes one face among billions. You delay the answer until your nervous system has come back. You refuse the dopamine of outrage when it's offered. You do this every day for years. What you build, doing this isn't a personality, it's a circuit. The prefrontal brake gets stronger, the vagal brake gets stronger, the default mode network gets quieter, the amygdala fires less, recovers faster, listens better to the cortex. The brain you walk around with at the end isn't the one you started with, it's rewired hardware. This is why people who have practiced these moves for a long time look unbothered to everyone else. They aren't unbothered, they have built a brain that processes the same provocation through different circuits. The insult that would have leveled them at 25 lands now on tissue that has been trained for 2 decades to absorb it without breaking. You have the same hardware Marcus had, the same amygdala, the same prefrontal cortex, the same vagus, the same default mode network. The instruments of your own surgery are sitting in your skull right now, waiting for the only thing they require, which is the daily practice that turns them on. The Stoics handed you the protocol, the neuroscientists handed you the receipts. What happens next is the only part that has never changed in 2,000 years. It's up to you.